Please be seated. Oh, and Diane, thank you so much for sharing your gifts with us and leading us in worship this morning. We are in a series we started last week called the United Methodist Way, and without being too repetitive, as I said last week, this is a good time for us to be thinking about this together, I think, because in the beginning of a new year is a good time to think about who we are and who we're called to be. And also with the General Conference of the United Methodist Church, it's a global gathering every 4 years. The church, this is an important time too, because in that conference we will be thinking carefully about who we are and who we are called to be. And so it's a good time for us to think about what we share in common and who we are as United Methodists. And today I'm going to be talking about the general rules. You're probably thinking, oh, really? We're going to talk about rules. This is going to be exciting. Well, we kind of have that attitude toward rules, don't we? Especially when it comes, it seems to me, to religion, because there are forms of religion that are overburdened with rules and that can become crushing and spirit-killing, really. You may have read the book, a very entertaining book, and moving also, by A.J. Jacobs, called The Year of Living Biblically. A.J. Jacobs decided to live according to all of the rules and regulations that he could find in Scripture for a year. And he scoured Scripture and he found 700 rules and regulations. How we relate to one another and what we wear and what we eat and what we do and how we worship and everything else. And he put those into practice for a year. He drove himself crazy, his wife crazy, his friends crazy during that year. And then he wrote about that experience. 72 pages of his book is what it took to list all the rules and regulations that he found in Scripture. So when we talk about rules, we can talk about that version of religion, and it becomes oppressive and simply impossible. That's not what we're talking about this morning. A group of 8 or 10 people came to John Wesley in 1739 in the early days of the Methodist movement, and they said, "Help us live a Christian life. What are some tools you can give us? Help us to know how it is we are to live." And so, if at that point John Wesley had handed them 72 pages, here, do these 700 things, that would have been the end of the Methodist movement and we would not be here today. But instead, what John Wesley did was he thought carefully about the teaching of Scripture and about the practices that we have in Christian tradition, what is reasonable, what makes sense in the lives of people, what his own experience was, and the experience of others. And in thinking through that, he gave them the general rules. And there are only 3 of them, and they're very simple. Do no harm, do good of every possible sort, and stay in love with God. Do no harm, do good of every possible sort, and stay in love with God. Simple. And yet, of course, he knew when he gave them the rules that in that simplicity, there's also within it a complexity as we seek to live that out. I think about race car driver Bill Vukovich back in the 1950s, who won the Indianapolis 500 2 years in a row. A reporter asked him, "What's your secret? What's the secret of your success?" And he responded, "Well, there's no secret. I just put the accelerator to the floor and steer left." And well, that's simple. And yes, that boils it down to its simplicity. But within that, of course, he knew, and we know, there's a little bit of complexity there too, as he lived that simple rule out. Or think about Jesus. Someone came to Jesus once and said, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment?" And Jesus boiled it down to something very simple. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second one is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And why did Jesus answer that way? Well, he wanted to boil it down to that which was simple. And yet we all know within that simplicity, there is some complexity when it comes to living that out. And so it is with the general rules. And the first of those is do no harm. Wesley, when he taught this, John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, when he came up with these general rules, he taught that there are two ways, basically, in which we can do harm. And that is, we can do harm to ourselves and we can do harm to others. We can do harm to ourselves by eating the wrong things, by drinking the wrong things, by overindulging, by submitting ourselves to too much stress, if we have the ability to turn away from that. We can do harm to ourselves through the way that we live our lives. We can do harm to ourselves in our relationships. If we are passive in a destructive relationship, that can be harmful to ourselves. The list can grow quite long if you think about it. There are a lot of ways in which we can harm ourselves physically, emotionally, spiritually. And so the first do no harm has to do with the way we treat ourselves. Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, and implied in that is a love of self. But of course, love your neighbor is the second of the greatest commandments. And in that is, and also captured in the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, in that is captured, do no harm to others. And so, if we stop and think about it, there are a lot of ways in which we can do harm to others. Very few of us in this room, if any, would even contemplate doing physical harm to someone else. But through the words we say, the way we live, the decisions we make, even the way we carry out our occupation, or the way we relate to our families, it is possible to do harm to other persons, and we all know that to be the case. So what if every morning you thought about the general rules, and the first one being, do no harm. And throughout the day, from time to time, you think about that general rule, do no harm. How would it change the way you relate to others and the way you treat yourself? The things that you do, the decisions you make, the lifestyle that you lead, do no harm. A friend of mine, Bob Johnson, who is executive pastor at Chapelwood United Methodist Church in Houston, did a series on the general rules a few years ago, and he told me that he kept a blog, or wrote a blog, of the experiences that he had because he committed himself to think about it constantly and to live strictly by the general rules. And at the end of that, he summarized what he had learned, and the top two things he had learned were these. First of all, his wife noticed a big difference in him right away, and she commented on it. And so he learned that people notice, that it's visible when we live by the general rules. The second thing that he learned that surprised him is that the hardest of the three general rules to keep was the first one. He had imagined, and perhaps you're imagining too, that the first general rule, do no harm, would be the easiest. But he said it wasn't. As he was more and more aware of that first general rule as he lived his life every day, he began to realize more and more how many ways he could do harm. And it made him so much more aware of the way that he related, the way he treated himself, and the way he treated others, and what he did and the decisions he made, and so on and so on. Do no harm, the first of the general rules. Now, the second two of the general rules, do good of every possible sort and stay in love with God. Those two, Wesley taught, are ways of experiencing and sharing God's grace. He called them means of grace. That is, the things that we do enable us to experience God's grace and enables others to do so also. That's why this passage from the book of James is so important, especially that verse that says, "Be doers of the word and not hearers only." Be doers of the word and not hearers only. See, it's what we do that matters. As Mr. Mark taught us a moment ago, my actions speak louder than my words. Oh yeah, right? It's true. And that's what James was saying in effect. What good is it if you don't live out your faith? In another place in the book of James, he says, faith without works, without putting it into action, is dead. So what is it that keeps faith alive? What is it that enables the grace of God to be very present in our lives and in the lives of others around us? What keeps it vibrant? And Wesley called these actions, these things that we do, means of grace. So in the second general rule, do good of every possible sort, Wesley called those the works of mercy. These are the means of grace that enable us to experience the grace of God and enables others to do so because we are doing good of every possible sort. And he took that list from a couple of places. One, the book of Acts, in our scripture we heard a moment ago, where it talked about what the early church did. We'll look at that again in a moment. But also, as he thought about what is it that we do in living as God's people in the world that enlivens our faith and that makes present God's grace, and he turned to the parable of the Last Judgment that Jesus told, in which those who had fed the hungry and had given given water to the thirsty, and had given clothing to those who had no clothing, and had given shelter to those without a home, and had visited those sick and in prison, and had welcomed the stranger, he taught that those who had done those things had done it to the Lord himself. And those are means of grace. When we do those things, and any act of kindness and good, we make present the grace of God, and we make the world a better place as well. It's the second general rule, do good of every possible sort. I was reading recently about Susan Sarandon, and I was really inspired by something she does. Susan Sarandon, the actress. When she's traveling and she's on location, she calls ahead of time and she talks to the mayor and the churches in the area, and she asks the question, who is doing the most good in feeding people or in caring for children or in helping in some other tangible way? And she finds that out, and then when she is on location, when she has breaks, she goes and she serves food, or she goes and hands out clothing, or she goes and paints a porch, or cares for a child, or whatever the volunteer activity is. She is putting into practice, wherever she is, the means of grace. Her faith is informing what she does. And I find that inspiring. When they asked her about it, she said, wherever you go, there's food to be distributed, there's clothing to be handed out, there are porches to be painted, and there are children to be cared for. And that's true. When I think about the members of this congregation and all the ways that you serve, you may not know it, but what you are doing is practicing means of grace. You are making present God's grace in your own life and in the lives of others. And you're keeping your faith alive. It's the second general rule. Do good of every possible sort. The third one is stay in love with God. Now, when Wesley taught this one, Wesley looked at the book of Acts in particular, this second chapter of Acts that is our other scripture reading for today. And he saw what the early church was doing. And what were they doing? They were praying, and they were worshiping together, and they were experiencing community together. They were sharing a common sacred meal, Holy Communion. They were serving. They were studying and learning and teaching. They were doing all of these things. And so we realize that all of those things and the disciplines of our faith and what Christians have practiced down through the ages are a means of experiencing God's grace and making it present. They're a means, really, of staying in love with God. They're a way that we keep our faith strong and we keep our relationship with God vibrant. Think about it. In any relationship with someone you love, don't you work at it? It doesn't just happen. You work at it. But it's a work that's not onerous. Rather, it's a work that comes naturally to do for your beloved what you can do. And to work to make sure that your communication stays strong. And to work to make sure you stay in relationship with the other. It means really being willing and also putting into practice the giving of yourself. And so to stay in love with God means exactly those things. To practice the disciplines of our faith, of study and prayer and corporate worship and Holy Communion, and also being in community with one another and sharing life together and holding one another accountable in our faith. Stay in love with God. That's the third general rule. What it really boils down to is something that seems very simple, but of course within it is some complexity. Because as we begin to live into these general rules and as we seek to make them present before our eyes every day so that we can put them into practice, we realize that it may not be so easy every day to do that. And there are complexities. But in the doing of those things, God's grace is present, made present in a tangible way, and our faith is enlivened and kept alive. As I think about the commitments we make and the way that we live those out, or maybe I should say the commitments I make and the way I live those out, you can judge for yourself how it applies to you. I think about the old story of the young man who wrote a letter to his girlfriend. And in the letter he said, "Dear Jane, I love you more than anything else in the world. I love you so much that I would scale the highest mountain, I would crawl through the deepest valley, I would swim the widest ocean for you. Love, John. P.S. I'll be over Saturday night if it doesn't rain." And I think about that. You know, we say, "Oh Lord, I love you so much." We sing those words. I will love you in a tangible way by upholding my church and by living out in my life my prayers and presence and gifts and service and witness. P.S. I'll pray if I can find the time. I intend to be present in the worshiping community or at a Bible study if I don't get a better offer. Or if anything's left over at the end of the month, I'll give. Or I'll serve one of these days when I get around to it. I'm going to find the time to do that. And I'll put in a good word for you one of these days. But you know, it just never seems to be the right time to talk about such things. The three general rules challenge us to do what James called us to do. And he leaves us with a challenging image, doesn't he? He says to have faith and not put it into practice is like a person who sees his reflection in a mirror and then walking away from the mirror forgets what he looks like. He says that's the way it is if we believe and we don't do anything about it. If we have faith and we don't put it into action, we're like a person who sees his reflection in the mirror and then walks away forgetting what he looks like, forgetting who he is. We hear the words, we know the things that we're called to do, we know what would keep our faith alive, and we know what makes God's grace present in our lives and makes a difference in our lives and in our world, but we walk away from it and we forget. See, the general rules and the means of grace are ways to remind us over and over again. They're like a mirror in which we peer to see ourselves clearly and remember who we are so that we can go and be God's people in the world. So I pray for you and for me that we'll take some time every day, or most days if we can work it in, to remember the 3 general rules. And not just remember them, but really let them be a part of the way we live. Confessionally, I can tell you when I don't do that, it makes a difference. And when I do that, it makes a difference. Amen.